Centralia, Pennsylvania, one of the most famous ghost towns in the world because it's been on fire for 60 years and will continue to burn for another 250 more. The fires are not above ground, mind you, but are instead burning through the unmined coal veins beneath the town, causing sinkholes and poisonous gas that has laid waste to the town above. Now, the streets are all but empty, though they are occasionally smoke-filled, and little remains to indicate where homes once stood. When we explore a western ghost town, most of them were short-lived boom towns that flashed in their respective pans and faded from existence as their residents moved on to better prospects. But that isn't the story of Centralia. Centralia is a town that some families called home for generations, a town where many people were born, lived, loved, and grew old in. The story of Centralia goes back 2.5 centuries. One of the first owners of the land was a man named Robert Morris, a veteran of the American Revolution and a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Robert went bankrupt and lost the land before he could do anything with it. But the first development of the land began around 1810, when the Reading Road was built through the valley. First surveyed in 1770 by a man named Francis Yarnell, the Reading Road was an early turnpike that connected the towns of Reading and Sunbury in Pennsylvania. Now, it was well known that anthracite coal was common in the area, and small-scale mining operations were set up across the valley. And in 1831, a man named Jonathan Faust managed to acquire, through illegitimate means, enough lumber to build an inn. Now, without even properly gaining permission from the landowner, Faust just started building a tavern along the Reading Road in the middle of this remote valley, along the stretch between Mount Carmel and Ashland. And nobody stopped them. He called it Bull's Head Tavern, and as mining cabins popped up nearby, the area became known as Bull's Head. It was 10 years later that the young town was purchased by the Locust Mountain Coal and Iron Company, who brought in an engineer named Alexander Ray to plot and develop the small town of Bull's Head into a proper community. Now, Jonathan Faust didn't complain because he didn't own the land anyway, and really hoped that the mining company wouldn't notice. Well, it turns out they did notice, and they didn't care. The first thing Alexander Ray, the mining company's engineer, did was rename it to Centerville and apply for a post office. Well, turns out Pennsylvania already had a Centerville, so our boy had to come up with a new name, and he chose Centralia. The town was officially incorporated in 1866 with Alexander Ray as the official founder. The Reading Road became Route 61, which still winds through the town, making a 90-degree turn to the west at the town center. Well, now the mining companies needed laborers, so in came the Irish. Centralia had a massive influx of Irish Catholic immigrants in the 1850s, following the opening of the Locust Mountain Coal and Iron Company at the top of the hill. As a result, Centralia became a mostly Irish Catholic community. Now, at first they attended Sunday Mass at the nearby town of Ashland, but when Harrisburg became a diocese of its own in 1868, Centralia was given its own church, named St. Ignatius, and the land for which was donated by the Coal and Iron Company. Most of the town's men worked at the mine. They prayed at St. Ignatius, and they drank at the Bull's Head Tavern. It was a simple living, but not all was right in Centralia. The Bull's Head Tavern was home to meetings of a secret society called the Molly Maguires. The Molly Maguires was a group of Irishmen who sprang up in Pennsylvania during this time, targeting corrupt and abusive mining companies, and often violently clashed with unfair company men. Others claimed that they were a terrorist organization. Now, those of you familiar with Pennsylvania mining history will know how 20 of the Molly Maguires were hanged in the 1870s across the coal regions of Pennsylvania after having been targeted by the Pinkerton Detective Agency. But a handful of little-known executions occurred right here in Centralia. On October 17, 1868, while driving his carriage from his home in Centralia to nearby Mount Carmel, Alexander Ray was stopped by 4 miners belonging to the Molly Maguires, who attempted to rob him of the company's payroll. Unfortunately for everyone involved, Ray wasn't carrying the payroll, so the robbers shot him multiple times. The men got away with it for 10 years, when the Pinkerton agency managed to link them to the crime. Only 3 of the men were still alive 10 years later, and these 3 were hanged in 1877. But let's not focus on the few blemishes of Centralia's history. Centralia was an overall bustling, happy community. By the late 1800s, Centralia reached its peak population of nearly 2,800 people. Most of them were parishioners of St. Ignatius Catholic Church on the top of the hill, which in 1890 had a membership of 3,000 people. A rectory, a convent, and a school were all built nearby. We can see these buildings in several old photographs of St. Ignatius. Trolley lines connected Centralia to both Ashland and Mount Carmel. The town had more than 24 saloons, a handful of hotels, countless homes and shops, and even 2 theaters. It's here, at the site of the municipal building built in the 1970s, that the original Centralia Firehouse once stood. Across the street from it, at the corner of Locust and Railroad Streets, is where the general store once stood, pictured here in 1906. Railroad Street was the location of, you guessed it, the railroad. A branch of the Lehigh Valley Railroad ran right through the town. So there were 2 sets of tracks coming right down Railroad Street here. And you can see behind me where they curved north. As they crossed Locust right here, there was actually a switch right where the curve began. It curves to the north, but then it straightens back out to the east, and that would have taken them to other towns down that way, and eventually linking up at the town of Penhaven, now a ghost town as well, and perhaps I'll explore that someday. This is actually the Mahanoy branch of the Lehigh Valley Railroad. Because this area is so mountainous, it's actually very expensive for the railroad company to carve the width needed for 2 different tracks coming through the mountains. So the fact that they have 2 tracks coming through Centralia really speaks to the amount of traffic coming through here, that this was that important to have 2 different tracks. This would have serviced both passengers and freight.
The street followed the railroad right-of-way, which was over here, for another block. And then past that block, it dead-ended. The trail, which was most likely utilized by the railroad, continued on for about another 1/4 mile, as it still does today. It's a little bit shady though. I've seen some nasty items over there, so. This is almost certainly the location of the depot. This would have been that telegraph pole.
This other view of the station would more or less be from this general angle, but you'd be standing over there. The cameraman will be in those trees because the tracks came along here, and it's on the far side of the tracks. What'd you find in there, Matt?
Pennsylvania Keys, wait, 1964.
Woo! Look at that.
Good find.
It was balled up in a ball there. I saw it glistening in the light.
We had that pattern on our furniture.
I have some furniture that had such a pattern.
Found a rifle round, 270 Winchester.
Oh!
It has been fired, but it did not go off. The pin has hit it from the hammer.
It's been struck.
It's been struck, but it has jammed in this barrel.
Sheesh. In December 1908, a fire ripped along the main street of Centralia, destroying more than 40 buildings. As a result, 150 people were left homeless. Nonetheless, Centralia rebuilt. The World Wars and the Great Depression hit the mining industry hard, and the population of Centralia began to decline. 1918 also saw an outbreak of influenza in the town that killed more than 10% of Centralia's population. Another notable incident in Centralia history occurred in 1948 when a DC-6 airliner, United Airlines Flight 624, crashed en route to New York City, killing all 43 people on board. The impact site was just to the north of Centralia, and the recovery efforts were based out of the town. By 1960, Centralia was a peaceful, quiet community with one operational coal mine and a population of 1,435 people. The original town dump site was not too far from St. Ignatius Church, and every Memorial Day weekend, the town would actually burn off all of the trash in the dump to eliminate odors and to compact the trash that they have and basically reduce it down to ashes. The town dump site, however, was forced to shut down when Pennsylvania revised their waste elimination laws in the 1950s. As a result, illegal dump sites started popping up all across Centralia, and there were 8 of these total. This forced the town of Centralia to set up a new dump site. An old pit mine from the 1930s by Oddfellows Cemetery was selected, and that's where we're standing right now. Trash was dumped into the pit mine 50 feet down, and all the illegal dump sites across the town were collected and dumped in as well. Memorial Day 1962 came around, and it was time for the fire department to burn the trash. They set up a controlled burn on the morning of May 27th, and then they extinguished the flames that night. 2 days later, the flames returned. The fire department doused it. A week later, the flames returned. The fire department doused it, and then again, and they doused it. So something was going on. The flames kept returning. So crews were brought in to then churn up the trash so that they could douse the lower levels and get anything that was smoldering below. And that's when they realized an even greater problem. There was a hole in the wall of the pit mine that gave access for the flames to an old vein of coal. So now coal under the town and the old mines dating back to the 1850s were now on fire. On August 6th, a full 2.5 months after the ignition of the fire, a meeting was held to discuss how the fire would be handled. The origins of the fire, having been started by controlled burning by the municipal government, was concealed by the council. It was simply said that the fire had unknown origins. Proposals were put forward to put the fire out. One man, an engineer with the Department of Mines and Mineral Industries, said that he'd put the fire out for $175. Another miner said that he would do it for free if he could just keep the coal that he dug up along the way. Both plans were rejected in favor of a state-run solution. A contract for $20,000 was awarded to an excavation company who felt confident that they could put the fire out. However, when it came time to act, the state restricted their operations to a small area and refused to allow the company to do any of their own surveying or exploratory digging to see the real perimeter of the fire. They were also only permitted to work on weekdays for 8 hours a day. This prevented them from being able to dig fast enough to control the fire, and the digging that they could get done allowed a greater influx of oxygen into the tunnels. In short, the digging was kept at too slow a speed, and the fire outpaced them. The project funding ran out at the end of October of that year, and by then, the underground fire was reaching the edges of town. Another project was funded to pump crushed rock and water into the ground to contain the fire, but harsh winter conditions prevented the work from being efficiently executed, and the fire continued to spread. Further projects were considered, including digging a trench and filling it with concrete, but they were abandoned in 1963. Despite the spreading fire, daily life in Centralia carried on more or less as usual. I'm standing at the street corner of Center Street and Locust, where in 1966 a family with a camera gathered to watch the Centralia Centennial Parade. It had been 100 years since the town was founded, and the town was still full of life and happiness and joy, despite the fact that the fire had already begun raging beneath their feet. Despite their awareness of the fire, the town didn't know that the fates of their homes was all but sealed. In fact, the townspeople were optimistic. They placed a time capsule beneath the grounds of the American Legion Post 608 near St. Ignatius Church. This concrete and cinder block foundation was once the site of the town's war memorial. A bell and brass plaque was erected here by the American Legion. Don't worry, it wasn't vandalized, stolen, or destroyed. American Legion Post 608 moved the memorial to their new location in nearby Wilburton, Pennsylvania in 2009. It's now 1967, and railroad service to Centralia has stopped. This wasn't due to the fire. but simply the decline of rail traffic in the United States at the time. But it was a sign of things to come for the town. After nearly 4 years of red tape and paperwork, approval was finally given to dig a large trench to contain the fire, but it was too little, too late. The fire had already spread 225 feet below the ground, and the project was abandoned. It would be another 2 years before the state would make another attempt. Residents began suffering from the effects of the fire, falling ill and lowering the quality of their lives. In 1969, the state began constructing another barrier out of fly ash, which came with its own health problems but was seen as the lesser of two evils. This would take 5 years to complete, and 2 years into the project it was already seen that it would fail, as the barrier began collapsing and the fire was discovered beyond the containment zone. Nevertheless, the state decided to still spend money on completing the project, which did nothing, but they still called it a success and claimed that the project was solved.
You got all these DER officials, OSN, and Bureau of Mines, all these workers up there for years. They've been working there for years, but they say there's no mine fire.
And perhaps to demonstrate how confident the state was in their solution, a new government municipal building and firehouse was constructed in Centralia in 1977. It stands mostly vacant today. Despite this, after the state claimed the problem was solved, the town residents split into two factions. Those who wanted the damages fixed and to be able to stay in their family homes, which many of the families lived in for over 100 years, and the other group believed that the government caused this mess and should pay for them to relocate. Both sides had their points, and I can understand both of their perspectives. They argued at every town meeting, and the different opinions split the town in two.
People fighting against each other as far as brother against brother and sister against sister and things of this nature. There's no word to describe the kind of problems that exist in the town today.
A Unity Day was organized to bring the town people together and to draw media attention to their problems and to hold a special mass service at St. Ignatius Church. The day was a success and the town was united until it was admitted that the fire was still spreading, and a survey was published shortly after that found that the cost of extinguishing the fire would be $660 million, almost $2 billion today, and would require the partial destruction of the town regardless. The town's positivity was completely crushed. It's now 1979. This is the site of Coddington's gas and service station. It's also the site of the first signs that the Centralia mine fire was more serious than they'd imagined. On November 21st, 1979, gas station owner John Coddington noticed steam rising from the vacant lot next to his gas station. 2 days later, on November 23rd, he measured the temperature of the gas beneath his gas station in the underground tanks, and they were hot, 122 degrees Fahrenheit. A few days later, that temperature had risen to 136 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, if the gasoline got too hot, it could ignite or combust and blow the whole station up. The gas tanks were empty, the gas station was abandoned, and Coddington's gas station became the first building casualty of the Centralia fire, being demolished 2 years later. It's 1980, 1 year after the underground heat was measured at Coddington's gas station. These large air vents were installed directly above the fire's location. This is one of the smoke vents that was drilled into the dump site to let the gases leak out. And the idea was that putting these vents in there would enable the gas to come up in a controlled location as opposed to seeping up through the ground and the streets and the basements of the residents of the town. Now, it worked. But once the fire passed this area, it was now an entrance for oxygen to the veins below and enabled the fire to spread a little bit quicker. The reason for this fence around it is to prevent people from touching it. Now, it doesn't matter anyway. These don't even vent the smoke. The fire has long since passed underground. However, back when these were installed in 1981, these could get burning hot. so the fence was put up around it to keep people at a distance. The threat of fire was now on people's minds, but it was also literally in their minds. Not only was heat rising up from the ground, but so were poisonous gases, and the townsfolk began suffering from carbon dioxide poisoning. One resident in 1981 said that my nose hurts, my eyes tear, I feel like a zombie, I just feel like going to sleep all the time. Another resident said that you could go to sleep at night, but you don't know if you're going to wake up in the morning. The town was scared, but it would take quite some time before the politicians were willing to do anything. Now, state health inspectors frequently came to visit homes and monitor the gas levels in them, but little more was done. It was on February 14th, 1981, that politicians and health inspectors came to Centralia to inspect in person to see if more action was needed. They came to see if they could find an immediate sign of danger, and their timing was perfect because they found it right here between Locust Street and Apple Alley over here. A 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski was playing in his grandmother's backyard when he saw smoke rising from the ground. He went over to investigate, and the ground collapsed beneath him. Wafts of poison gas and tremendous heat kept shooting past him, and the ground collapsed even further. He held onto a tree root to keep from falling deeper into the hole as bursts of up to 350 degrees Fahrenheit went past him. Finally, his cousin was able to pull him out of the hole to safety. It's said that that sinkhole was possibly up to 150 feet deep. It formed by fires burning out the underground coal and creating unsupported voids beneath the town. As gas and heat compromised the solidity of the ground above, some of these voids collapsed. Todd was safe, but Centralia most certainly wasn't. The state of Pennsylvania approved a $42 million fund to buy the Centralia homes and help them relocate. But the way it was handled, however, made some of the residents want to stay even more.
The appraiser appraised our house at $43,000, but the government offered us $17,000. If we did not accept the offer to move, should they take our neighbor on our other side, they would never come back and give us a second chance. In other words, it was a take it or leave it situation. If we didn't accept it the first time, we would be stuck there, and they would take everyone alongside of us and leave us there.
It's worth $36,000, but we were offered $11,000 for it. They took off depreciation for this and that, and you ended up with that, and you took it or you stayed there, and we definitely couldn't stay.
In 1992, Governor Bob Casey claimed the remaining properties in Centralia by eminent domain, but evictions were put on hold by the next governor, Governor Tom Ridge. Centralia still lost its post office in 2002. Years later, in 2009, Governor Ed Rendell began evicting people once again. Legal battles ensued, and the state reached an agreement that some residents can continue living in Centralia, but their homes would go to the state when they die, and cannot be left to their descendants. Some residents believed that the state had ulterior motives. They believed, especially by 2009, that the fire had already passed beyond the town, and the state was only interested in the mining rights for the town, as they believed there's up to $2 trillion in coal still unburned below. Others believe that all that coal has long since burned off, and even if it hadn't, the value of anthracite coal continues to decline today. There certainly is quite a bit of coal still beneath the town, as it's estimated that the fire will continue to burn for over 250 more years. While nobody in Centralia was directly killed by the fire, many former residents of Centralia developed cancer as a result of long-term exposure to the poison gases. Eventually, even St. Ignatius at the top of the hill was forced to close. The final Sunday Mass was June 25th, 1995, but the final service was, quite fittingly, a funeral the following day. St. Ignatius was torn down in November 1997. We've actually got the edge of a foundation right here. This was probably the outer wall of the church.
And with the proximity of it to the cemetery, this would probably be the altar area.
So this would have been inside the church, and then by the time you get to these large, old trees, you're back outside, and then just beyond that would have been the priest's house, the rectory.
So yeah, it looks like with this line of trees, even in the image of the old church and the rectory from the earlier 20th century, you can see that there was trees in between the two, and I wouldn't doubt that at least one of these much older trees was present in that image.
As the town was torn down, nature reclaimed the land, even to the point where some streets are completely gone. This clearing here, this is the remains of Elkton Street. Nothing left of it now. Elkton Street is completely gone without a trace. And on the corner of Elkton and Park, right here was the Russian Orthodox Church. The name of it was Saints Peter's and Paul Russian Orthodox Church. This beautiful timber structure was right in the path of the underground fire and was torn down in 1986. By 1994, the deterioration of Highway Route 61, the old Reading Road to the south of town, and the main road towards Ashland had gotten so bad that it needed to be temporarily closed for major reconstruction. An entire bypass was built around it, detouring traffic to the Byrnesville Road and constructing a mile-long stretch of two-lane highway that paralleled Route 61 until it linked back up with the main road to the southwest. This temporary solution became permanent when it was determined to be impossible to fix the original stretch of 61, and the old Byrnesville Road had now become the new Route 61. You can still see the sharp turn where the road detours on both ends of the closed section. For almost 25 years, the closed stretch of highway was the most iconic attraction to the ghost town of Centralia, becoming known as Graffiti Highway, for obvious reasons. All the while, cracks in the highway continued to grow. The old stretch of highway was private property and increasingly dangerous as sinkholes spread. Police would chase people off, but eventually the highway needed to be demolished for good to deter visitors. Well, not quite demolished it, but buried it. In 2020, dump trucks made countless trips hauling dirt onto the highway, piling it up in tall mounds, until the whole stretch of Old 61 was buried under thousands of hills of dirt. Today, the police don't mess around. Trespass on the dirt-covered highway and you'll get a stiff fine. Despite Centralia becoming a ghost town, the active Route 61 is still frequently traveled, with thousands of drivers coming through the town daily. I wonder how many of them know the history of the land that they drive through. A half a mile south of Centralia's town center is the now ghost town of Byrnesville. So close, in fact, that at the end of their days, Centralia was close to absorbing Byrnesville. Main Street of Byrnesville used to continue on behind me for a few more miles all the way down to the town of Ashland. However, it was a steep downhill grade, so in the 1940s that road was closed because of too many runaway cars losing their brakes going down and crashing into downtown Ashland. Like Centralia, Byrnesville was abandoned because of the mine fire, so I guess the name of Byrnesville was quite fitting. In reality, though, it was named for the Byrne family, the first settlers of the town in 1856. It was a mining town, with houses built for the workers of the coal mines nearby. The town grew, though it never came close to the size of thousands living in Centralia, but it grew enough to have 3 grocery stores, bars, and a school kept up until the 1930s. The final population before the evacuation was 75 people, and the final home was abandoned and torn down in 1996. This is an old service station. Yeah, you can see cars would come up here, and this would give access to underneath of them. This is probably quite a few feet deep. You see the steps that used to go down. It was burned down when they demolished the town. There's a lot more trash dumped here in Byrnesville. Now there's people, probably former residents, who come through Centralia every so often and clean up all of the trash. They have clean up Centralia days, but I don't think anyone thinks to clean up Byrnesville. The only significant structure remaining in Byrnesville is the shrine to the Blessed Virgin Mary behind me along the side of the highway. It was erected in the 1950s by the Riley family, owners of a grocery store in Byrnesville. It was made with primitive materials found in modest coal mining towns. For example, the two alcoves on either side are simply made of old bathtubs. But this was built as a labor of love by the Riley family, and a lot of the community donated to it. Mr. Riley's sons, now in their 80s, still maintain the shrine. Both Centralia and Byrnesville already fell victim to the coal fire, but the destruction today is not over yet. A few miles to the north of Centralia is the small town of Orestes. Now, because the vein of anthracite stretches all the way from Centralia up to the north, within a few decades, those flames underground will have reached Orestes and they'll have to evacuate. So what Centralia is now, Orestes will be. The time capsule that was planted in 1966 at the town's Centennial commemoration was meant to bring the community together, but instead, it became another example of the old divisions within the town. It was meant to be opened after 50 years, meaning in 2016. In 2014, some selfish tourists decided that they were going to dig it up themselves and steal it. Fortunately, they failed, but their attempt was noticed, which prompted the town to recover it early. The residents who stayed fought against the residents who left Centralia, as well as the American Legion post, and both parties attempted to recover the time capsule for themselves. The American Legion post, working together with those who left the town, won the fight and recovered and opened the time capsule 2 years early in 2014. It was water damaged, but most items were salvageable. It contained a miner's helmet, a newspaper, and a pair of ladies' bloomers signed by the men of the town, among other things that shed light on the personality of the town in 1966. At the time of filming this in 2022, there are 5 residents who still call Centralia home. I wanted to interview at least one of them, but this might sound silly, but I didn't want to disturb them. Tourists come through here every few minutes, snapping photos and taking footage. Honestly, not too different from what I was doing. And I didn't want them to feel like they were some spectacle. They deserve some peace and quiet, and that's scarce in Centralia, despite the lack of residents. The Centralia Fire Station still serves the nearby communities, but the only public building still in service in the town is the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary Ukrainian Catholic Church, sitting atop the hill overlooking the abandoned town site. It's surrounded by a handful of houses, and was allowed to stay only because it didn't sit atop the burning coal veins. It still holds Sunday services. Very few buildings still stand in Centralia. As the residents moved out, their homes were torn down by the state. Many of these rows were built as townhouses, designed so that they structurally support each other along the row. And as some of these townhouses were torn down, the structural integrity of the other townhouses in that row was compromised. This house is the last remaining house in a row of townhomes, and when the other ones were demolished, brick buttresses needed to be erected in order to support the exterior wall of this house, which was formerly an interior wall. Many of the streets of Centralia are cracked and overgrown, with remnants of sidewalks and foundations barely exposed beneath the dirt. A walk through Centralia is almost like a walk through a large wildflower garden. Butterflies, birds, and even turkeys can be seen if you wander the streets. Preservationists have even begun planting apple trees where houses once stood. As we explored the winding streets to nowhere, a faint, haunting steam whistle can be heard in the distance, reminiscent of when the Lehigh Valley Railroad came through Centralia, or the steam whistles for the workers in the coal mines on the hill. No, it wasn't some specter. It was just an antique train at the Pioneer Mine in the nearby town of Ashland. While the fire has mostly moved on from beneath the town site, and the vents drilled into the ground no longer smoke, you can still see a solid plume of white smoke escaping from cracks in the earth about 2 miles east of the town in the forests along Big Mine Run Road.
Ooh, that's got a
Wow. Oh yeah. And that smell, that's definitely anthracite.
Why is anthracite coal unique, David?
The thing about anthracite coal is that it is 98% carbon. It's just 2% short of a diamond, and so it burns very cleanly, but it's not very easy to start. A lot of people who worked particularly for the Reading would have said that the reason for burning anthracite was not only its cleanliness, but its abundance throughout Pennsylvania.
You can actually feel the heat coming off of it, and you can smell all that carbon coming out. The story of Centralia, from its growth along the Reading Road and the tensions between the famous Molly Maguires and Pinkertons, to the small, slow-moving fire that still managed to move faster than bureaucracy, and the hundreds of people who had to abandon their homes, is a story that deserves remembering, even if the town is in the final stages of being wiped off the map. Thank you for joining me in this step back into time. My Patreon supporters have access to special features from this documentary, including an exclusive story about a trolley accident in downtown Centralia in 1911. A special thank you to my supporters on Patreon, especially Marlo Perez, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Trent Greger, Zach Richards, Tom Shavada, Donald Anderson, Cody Henricks, Joan Haynes, Sean Kimball, Rob M., Amos Mayhew, Corey Andrews, Nicholas Musella, Sult Bognar, Cole Tannick, Sophie Baber, Exotic Exploring, Jakob Martin Henson, Kelly Black, Stephen Schwankert, Rob, and Oliver Chinchan.